Spider-Man gets a vibranium suit and he fights Black Panther. This comic is amazing. So what this does is this initially opens up with a girl named Starling. And this actually leads us into the kind of vibranium situation that we're going to be talking about. But Starling is a girl named Tiana, and she's actually the daughter or the granddaughter of Adrian Toomes, the Vulture. The idea was that her father abandoned her when she was younger, and so one of the retcons that Marvel threw in here from really Cody Ziegler was that Adrian Toomes, in part, had been stealing money during his criminal activities in order to give money to like Starling and her family, right? Now, the cool thing is that ultimately she kind of starts to see him as sort of a father figure that she never really had. But then once she realizes he's a villain, even after getting her own Vulture-esque costume, she actually just kind of becomes a hero, which she had already been doing for quite some time. And in fact, it was her being a hero that led to her sort of encountering Adrian and saying like, you know, we can't necessarily be folks in the same way, right? Of course, that also happens in this, and it kind of leads to them going their separate ways. But the reason why all this matters is because once you switch over to Miles Morales, after, you know, kind of leaving Starling behind, Miles is in this fight with just this crazy guy named Zip Zephyr, which I don't know if this guy exists in Marvel or has existed previously. But this guy is amazing because this dude just like runs off the most ridiculous lines. Like he goes to attack these cops and he's like, "Bear my freeze, piggies," and then just like shoots these guys with like an ice blast. It's kind of cool, right? I mean, it's goofy, but it's amazing at the same time. Now, of course, Miles jumps in and Miles basically takes this guy to task and then ultimately ends up defeating him. But one of the big kickers to come out of this, and it's something that a lot of people tend to forget, especially after the events of Blood Hunt, is that Miles is still a vampire. And one of the things that he has to contend with here is that if he overuses his powers, his venom blast, essentially, it'll actually lead to his vampirism overtaking him. And he's not entirely sure why that's the case. And in fact, we'll get an answer here. But again, for those of you guys who didn't cover Blood Hunt, it's probably the best event that Marvel wrote that served no real purpose. But in effect, Blade was possessed by this incredibly powerful vampiric entity named Varney, and then basically tried to turn the earth into like eternal night so vampires could walk forever and yada yada yada. Blade was defeated, but during that time, it led to Miles being bitten by a vampire and then actually becoming a vampire himself. Specifically, he was bitten by Blade. And so because he hasn't really been cured, and because the end of Blood Hunt made it so that all vampires across the world could walk openly in the sun, Miles is just trying to contend with this. And so what he ends up doing is going to see Doc Sasquatch. And in fact, the two of them have kind of been working together for a little while. Now, Doc Sasquatch, most of you guys knew him as Doc Samson, right? Leonard Samson. During Al Ewing's run on Immortal Hulk, basically, he wasn't really able to quote unquote return to his body when he had gone through the green door. Basically, when anybody with gamma radiation dies, they end up in like the place below all, or effectively the one true hell. A green door opens, they pass back through it, and then they literally resurrect in the real world. That's why the Hulk can never actually die. But Leonard Samson couldn't go back into his own body. So we ended up resurrecting the body of Lankowski, who was the original Sasquatch, and then basically Doc Samson took over that body, and that's why he's Green Sasquatch. Anyway, the guy is literally a doctor, right? And he's exceedingly capable. The issue with this is that he tells Miles, just analyzing him for what he is, whenever it is that he uses his venom blast in the extreme, that yes, it leaves him exhausted, but it also allows his vampirism to take over. Basically, figuring out a way to kind of nullify that or balance those things out is only one part of the equation. He has to use his powers less, but if he uses them too much, it could potentially kill him. The other part of this is actually curing his vampirism, which can only be done through mystical means because he was turned into a vampire through mystical means, right? A possessed Blade. And so there's only so much information that Samson can really provide here. But what he does is say, like kind of in the background, that he's going to do a little bit of research and do some more work and see if it's possible to find some sort of cure for him. And so what ends up happening is that once Miles takes off and does his own thing, Sasquatch talks to a woman named Dr. Kwan and is like, your job is to actually go out there and do some field work, whatever form that takes. We don't really find out here. It happens off panel. But you're going to go out there and get some field experience, essentially. And so at that point, you switch over to Miles. And one of the things that goes on is that as Miles is swinging through the city, that what ends up happening is that he ends up coming across what's effectively a mugging or an attempted purse snatching or whatever. He grabs the guy and then just starts pummeling this dude way more than a Spider-Man normally should, right? His aggression is amped up, which again is another part of this that we'll talk about here in a second. But like he starts screaming at these guys and almost beats them within an inch of their life. And the guys are like, yo, man, we give up, dude. It's not that serious. And he's like, I don't care. And just like beats the crap out of these guys. Now, of course, the woman is just kind of like, hey, Spider-Man, thanks, dude. You didn't have to, you know, beat these guys within an inch of their life, but I appreciate the help. But this ends up leading to Spider-Man kind of realizing, okay, there's a few things that are going on here that he has to come to terms with. Because with his vampirism being what it is, and the fact that it overtakes his mood, that he ends up developing this kind of extreme aggression, which is really the first stage in him being amped up to the point where he like starts to try to devour blood, right? Like literally bite people and drink their blood, that he has to kind of keep himself in check and under control. And so at that point you switch over to Starling. And all that really goes on here with Starling, and it is kind of crazy, is she's literally got the Vulture at gunpoint, but there's a kind of conversation between the two of them where they sort of go back and forth, is that he says like, you know, I don't deny that I hurt people, but I did it in the greater good, right? All of their talk of power and responsibility, these superheroes, and they can't protect the people closest to them. I would never let that happen to you. Now, this is an important part of her character's development, just because of the fact that, again, once she found out that she was the granddaughter of the Vulture, right, an actual villain, that it made it very difficult for her to have like any kind of a meaningful relationship with him. Again, you know, during Zeb Wells' run on Spider-Man, she was kind of like, hey, we got to part company. And so there's this kind of on again, off again plot thread where it's just sort of him trying to come to terms with her and trying to make sure they maintain some kind of, you know, granddaughter and grandfather relationship. And it's her saying, yeah, you know, I need to think about it, that sort of thing. But in the midst of this conversation, and that's one of the things that happens when she sort of, you know, pulls a kind of de facto gun on him, right? She's like, you're out of your mind if you think that I'm going to let you threaten me and mine and walk off this roof in one piece. Now, it's one of the coolest things about her character, right? I know this is a Miles story. We're focusing on the whole Vibranium thing, but Starling is dope. Like, she's one of the coolest characters that's been introduced recently because she didn't take sass off of anybody, and it's amazing. Like, I love the way her character is done. Now, of course, this leads to Miles Morales showing up on the scene and immediately confronting Vulture. But like, when he goes to attack him, it's not just Miles attacking him and just like defeating him or momentarily incapacitating him. No, man, he draws blood. And considering how old the Vulture is, that's no small thing. So much so the Starling's just like, holy cow, right? Like, what in the world? And so that's when Vulture's just like, she's not the one you need to worry about, man, and like immediately goes to attack Miles Morales. Now, he does make a good point here when he says, you Spider-Man drove her away from me, filled her head full of lies. I will make you pay. Now, it's one of these really basic, you know, villain type statements or what have you. But one of the things, if you kind of look between the lines here, when it comes to Adrian Toomes, you could argue he's one of the most circumstantial villains that are out there in Marvel, because it's not as black and white as like villains are guys who do bad things and that's it, right? The reality here is that most villains, especially someone like Adrian, really started doing, or at least try to do the right thing, went about the wrong way of doing it, right? I mean, wanting to help your family or make sure your granddaughter's taken care of, that's great, that's admirable, right? Family takes care of family normally, unless your family's crazy. But stealing, robbing banks, right? Building an entire criminal enterprise, not the best way to go about it. But again, Miles kind of loses control in this moment and he goes max power. And he even says, like, I really want the Vulture to feel this, right? Full of so much energy, I feel like I'm about to explode. So I find a place to direct it, and literally goes after Vulture and just like brutally attacks him. Now understand, right? It's not one of these things where the Vulture's just like, oh my God, you know, I can't believe. He's just like, I fought you guys before. I've never had difficulty figuring out where you were going, what you were doing. Why are your movements so hard to track? One of the things to remember is that Miles has kept it a secret that he's a vampire. Nobody knows. Not even Starling knows. She's not even aware of any of that. She'll find out, but she's not aware of that. And literally Miles just says, like, you wanted all of this before, right? But you're looking like you have some regrets. Maybe you're just getting too old. Who knows, right? No shame in hanging any of it up. And he's just like, you merely caught me by surprise. A mistake that will not happen again. And he's like, then let's go, right? And so like when the fight breaks out between the two of them, yet again, Miles starts pulling out these different tricks. One of the things he does is he pulls out his lightsabers. Yes, Miles has lightsabers. Not technically lightsabers, but he can create energy swords. And it's amazing. It's one of the coolest things. That happened quite some time ago, right? At the very beginning, or at least one of the more recent Miles runs. I don't remember the exact one where it happened, but it was pretty dope. The bigger point here is that with him pulling out these tricks, being faster than he normally is, more agile than he normally is, and more aggressive than he normally is, Vulture doesn't know what to make of it, right? And he's like, you're some kind of a monster. And this ultimately leads to Vulture almost retreating. But at the end of the day, because Miles takes it so extreme on him and pummels him so badly, Starling actually gets mad at him, right? She's like, what are you doing? Like, get away from him. And he's like, I thought he was attacking you. And she's like, no, he was coming here to talk to me. You attacked him arbitrarily. And he's like, I just wanted to help. And she's like, there's a huge difference between helping and beating the guy to a pulp. And that's where Miles is like, I don't really know what happened. Like, I don't understand. Almost like he blacked out. Now we'll get kind of clarification on how all of this unfolds and what it all means. But Vulture, in talking to Starling, he says, look at this moment, Tiana, burn it into your memory. This is the person you've thrown away our relationship for. A prissy teen boy who can't control his worst impulses. Following him leads to nothing but pain. And that's where she's just kind of like, what's in your hand? And he's like, a reminder that this slight will not go unpunished, and literally throws a flashbang, right? And ultimately ends up taking off. But it creates a kind of rift between the two of them, right? Because one of the things that Marvel hasn't really hit on too much when it comes to Miles, and this kind of seems to be feeding into it, is just like adolescence, right? Coming of age. Hormones are raging, teenagers are so sure they've got the world figured out while knowing so little about it, and just all those little things, right? All those things where you want all the benefits of being independent with none of the responsibility that goes with it, and life doesn't work that way. And so with all that kind of happening with Miles, it's just this gigantic melting pot of all kinds of problems. Now, again, Marvel's kind of hit on those aspects of his character in years past, but not as much as they are now, because it all kind of seems like it's happening at the same time, right? Going through teenage angst and all that kind of stuff. And literally she says that, right? If you're gonna sit around and be all angsty, right? Just be all emo and feel like you're misunderstood by the world, and all that kind of stuff, with your hair that kind of hangs over your eyes and you always shake it away with your head. Like, if you're gonna do that whole thing, then do it somewhere else, man. Like, either that or grow up, right? It's just one of these really interesting conversations that kind of highlights the fact that she doesn't put up with anybody's nonsense. But that's where the whole vibranium element comes into play, because what ends up going on here is that Miles is contacted by Misty Knight. Now, I love that they brought her in here, right? You almost never see anything with Misty Knight, and it's so dope that she's here. But of course, she essentially says, okay, look, we have a little bit of information about your whole affliction, and you need to come to basically the hideout in order to get this information sorted out. Now again, because Starling doesn't know anything about what's going on, she's like, what's happening? And that's where Misty spills the beans and is like, basically Miles a vampire. And she's like, are you serious, man? A vampire, right? Like, that's no small thing, dude. It's not like you borrowed money from Misty Knight and haven't paid her back. You're a vampire, bro, right? And so ultimately she goes and gets her suit, and then of course they end up going to meet with Misty Knight and Dr. Kwan. Now the funny thing about this is that when Miles sees Dr. Kwan, he's like, man, she's a tall drink of water. But again, Kwan kind of tells him everything that's going on, sort of reiterating what it was that had happened in his meeting with basically Dr. Sampson, but also offering a little more information, right? She's like, essentially right now, your venom energy is what's suppressing some of your vampiric urges. I'd also attribute that to your biology, which is unique even among spider people. As long as you don't use too much venom energy biologically and physically, we're covered for now. That's where Starling's just kind of like, okay, but like, this sounds like a but, right? It sounds like there's some kind of a caveat here. And that's where Miles kind of figures it out and says they only know how to treat the physical and mental parts of it. It's the magic of it all that's tripping everybody up. And that's where Misty's just kind of like, lucky for you, my Rolodex goes deep. I made a couple phone calls. I know a guy who can help you out. And that's when Black Panther appears. Now, this is one of the coolest segments in Marvel in recent years. I love the way this whole thing goes down, because he literally tells him, okay, like, I hope you're ready, man, because the road ahead is going to be a very, very difficult one. And so when the two of them start talking, one of the things that Miles says is, I trust all of you guys to help me, but understand the vampirism is the source of all of this. What I don't want is to lose control and end up hurting somebody that I love and someone that I care about. And so at that point, Black Panther is like, okay, then here's what I want you to do, right? We need to kind of get a baseline for what's going on with you and how you work. He's like, I want you to focus. I want you to clear your mind except for everything that is your vampire urge. Focus on that. And then immediately, Black Panther goes to attack him, just as a kind of test, right? To see exactly how he's going to respond. Now, Miles gives this amazing monologue where he describes what it's like to be a vampire in these moments when the urge takes over, right? He says, my heart stops, so does time. I'm frozen just long enough to pour every ounce of willpower into not sinking my teeth into his flesh. But it's not enough. The reaction is animalistic, primal, pure. I bet even Hightail would have a hard time dodging it. Of course, Hightail being one of Miles' villains and really a Spider-Man villain in general, and is relatively fast, right? He says, but T'Challa is not Hightail. He's the Black Panther. And so when Miles goes to attack him, he says, this would have torn a normal man clean in half. Instead, it just bounces off his suit like it's nothing. It's like he's toying with me. It just makes me want to feed on him more. The more he talks, the more I want to hear him scream, see him bleed. But he meets every move I make with unwavering confidence. It must be his royal blood. It just makes me want to taste it even more. But as Black Panther not only dodges the attacks of Miles, but also kind of toys with him, largely because of the fact that Miles isn't really fighting rationally, he's fighting emotionally, and fighting emotionally really just kind of leads to downfall, right? Because thinking clearly is what keeps you on top. That Miles literally comments and he says, he's not just good, not just great, he's something more, but still, I'm Spider-Man. And that's when T'Challa chimes in and he's like, you seem to have some fight left in you, my friend. And while I'd love to test the extent of your might, I think it's best to bring this experiment to its close, and just grabs Miles and slams him on the ground as hard as you possibly can, which snaps Miles back to reality. And that's kind of what it's like for him, right? He literally goes into just kind of like this animalistic primal state where he sort of loses any semblance of self-control. There's only been a couple times in Marvel where this kind of thing has been depicted exceedingly well. One of the best examples of that was during Jeff Lemire's run on Old Man Logan, when he gives into his berserker rage and he describes what it's like, right? Let myself become madness, chaos, death, and like chops up Lady Deathstrike into pieces. Really, he just cuts off her arms and legs, but still, it's gruesome. But it's a really, really fascinating kind of scenario here, because one of the things that Black Panther does is once Miles has calmed down, he tells him, I've brought something with me. And he tells Miles, open it up, and it's a new suit. But the suit is not just a suit. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's almost Miles' own version of like the Iron Spider suit that Spider-Man had during the events of Civil War, where Black Panther tells him it's a vibranium nanomesh interwoven with an internal coaxial insulated coating. I don't even know what any of that means, but it sounds cool. It sounds dope. But at the end of the day, right, Dr. Kwan says, as hard as we tried, Dr. Sampson and I agreed this was the only way we could reasonably solve this stage of your infection. And Black Panther tells him that suit is properly regulating your internal venom energies. Such massive amounts of bioelectric energy need to be properly balanced if we hope to burn out this infection. And so T'Challa tells him, better regulation means better control. The vibranium insulation will allow you to have nearly 100% control over your powers. They won't be as potent as they were previously, but I'd say that it's a fair trade. And Miles loves it, right? Does the suit make him a little bit weaker? Yes. So there's obviously one of those things where Marvel's not gonna keep it on him permanently. But the trade-off here is that Miles doesn't have to hold back. He doesn't have to worry about getting into some kind of fight, losing control, and then like turning somebody into a vampire or whatever the case happens to be, or even losing his mind and just tearing them to ribbons. One of the other cool things that kind of continuing over, right, what this suit's capable of, Black Panther tells him that aside from regulating the venom energy that Miles has, that the suit is laced with a fine vibranium mesh that will protect you from most fatal injuries, and that the fabric is thinner than Black Panther's own suit, so as to allow Miles Morales to effectively be flexible, right, to do whatever a spider can. What he also tells him is, this suit will almost definitely appear in the Spider-Man 3 game. There's no way it doesn't show up in the PS5 game. But seriously, one of the coolest elements to this is that Miles' web shooters have effectively been augmented, and the webbing itself has been changed because now it's a vibranium-laced webbing, which makes it incredibly durable, more durable than spider webbing traditionally is, as if it even needed that enhancement. And so at that point, T'Challa's like, okay, like, let's see what you can do with this new suit. And so of course, Miles goes to punch him, and while he is able to put a lot of energy behind it, it feels like he's used hardly any energy at all. Now again, this is kind of the element of the suit that makes him a little bit weaker than he traditionally is, but at the same time, it allows him to fight for longer. So again, more sustained fight with a little less energy usage. Now the other part of this is that T'Challa tells him, because this only deals with the physical aspect of your vampirism, there's still the mystical side, and that cure cannot be found in any of these lands. We need to take you to a more mystical place in nature. The problem is that in the middle of all this, Vulture shows up. Right now, one of the cool things about it is Adrian Toomes shows up in his old school outfit. And when he goes to fight Miles, Miles is like, okay, cool, let's have this fight. Now, because of the fact that he has this new suit on, it allows him to basically maintain his sense of self. He doesn't get lost in the fight. He maintains control in his fight against the Vulture. And so when this goes down, it happens exactly the way that you would expect when Vulture fights Miles in his new suit. Vulture gets taken to the woodshed, son, and in no uncertain terms, Miles gives him the beatdown of a lifetime. It's absolutely amazing. He doesn't, again, lose himself the way he did before. But the fight between himself and Vulture is almost a kind of moral or metaphysical fight in a lot of ways, right? Where Vulture says, like, you're the reason Tiana is alone. You're the reason that we've been pulled apart. And the response of Miles is like, you're the supervillain, man. Like, you're the reason she walked away because you are a bad guy. Now, one of the coolest points, one of the most interesting things that Vulture argues here is he says, you're the worst kind of monster, the kind who convinced himself that he's one of the good guys. Now, is there merit to that argument? I don't necessarily know. I mean, there is a credible argument to be made that superheroes, by way of collateral damage and all that kind of stuff, are in some ways the problem, right? It's like that meme from Avengers. Hey guys, we saved the city. The city, right? It's totally in shambles, right? Like, how many people died in this collateral damage from the fight that the superheroes were in, facing off against a villain? And which one of these was supposed to be holding back to make sure that so many people weren't killed? Now, again, we're not talking about massive collateral damage and loss of life, but what we are talking about is collateral damage insofar as a superhero getting involved in the life of a person who is associated with a villain. Is it better that Tiana hang out with Miles than Vulture? 100%. No one's going to argue that. But it doesn't mean that his presence in her life was disruptive to the relationship that she had with her grandfather. And at the very least, his attempt to extend an olive branch, if for no other reason, than at the very least to get her to understand, right? Not necessarily sway her to his side, but to simply say, there's more to this picture than you're seeing. Let me explain it to you. But at the end of the day, none of it really makes any difference to Miles, right? He sees Vulture as a bad guy. Vulture is constantly on the affront, and Miles charging up his Venom Blast, but being able to maintain his sense of self, hammers into Vulture and sends this guy just crashing down to the point where Tiana steps in and literally delivers the kind of like defeating blow to him. And she basically tells him, like, you're a villain, right? Like, I get where you're coming from. I understand why you did the kind of things that you did, but at the end of the day, I'm choosing myself over you. I don't owe you anything. And even if I did, me owing you anything went out the window when I found out that you were a bad guy. So I'm sorry, I can't associate with you because you're a villain. And even though we're flesh and blood and you're my grandfather, it doesn't make any difference. And so ultimately she tells him, like, I understand how you feel, I understand the things that you've done and so on, but your circumstance, you being a villain and having to deal with the consequences of it, and literally the relationship between the two of us being destroyed, it's no one else's fault but your own. And where he asks, like, can you ever forgive me? She says, no. And then she makes this incredibly profound statement where she says, and I need you to look me in the eyes and understand me when I say, if you ever come after me and mine again, I'll bring something more serious than a tranquilizer gun. So it's literally like, we're done. But she's crying when she says it because she understands the significance of what she's doing. She's literally telling this last tie to her family, right? Because her father abandoned her, her mother's dead, so she has no more family out there, right? She's telling the last living link to her family tie, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And so ultimately, Vulture just kind of walks away and says, Tiana, I'll always love you. And maybe one day you'll find it in yourself to let me back in. And then ultimately he ends up leaving. Now, of course, she consoles with Spider-Man, but at the end of the day, like she just kind of says, look, here's the thing. If a member of my family is a killer, super duper villain, I definitely need you to help me, right? Like understand, you weren't wrong to help me out. But there are some battles that I need to fight on my own because it's not about you. It's about me. And that's one of the cornerstones, right, of relationships, making them work. Just because you can go to the rescue of your partner doesn't mean you need to. Sometimes all they want you to do is to stand in the corner and just say, you got this. And that's it. Not everyone needs or wants to be saved. And so it's really interesting because at that point, you switch back over to Black Panther and Miles is like, dude, you were here like the whole time? And Black Panther's like, yes, right? This trial was yours and Starling's. If intervention was truly needed, I would have given aid. I.e., it's the Vulture, bro. I'm the Black Panther. I'm an Avenger. You really expected me to get in a fight with Adrian Toombs? Not a chance, dude. It's actually the most Black Panther way to say, like, that dude's way too below my pay grade in order for me to concern myself with him. But the fact is, right, like, once it's all said and done, this leads to Black Panther saying, okay, like, you and I are going to go on a journey to basically a kind of mystical place. It looks like they're going to go to Wakanda, potentially somewhere else. If I were a betting man, I would say that he's going to take Miles to the Panther goddess Bast, and the two of them are going to figure out a way to remove the vampiric curse from his blood and turn Miles back to normal, which we'll find out when the comic comes out next month. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.